Welcome to Just Verdicts with your host, Brendan Lupetin, a podcast dedicated to the pursuit of just verdicts for just cases. Join us for in-depth interviews and discussions of cutting-edge trial strategies that will give you the keys to conquering the courtroom. Produced and powered by LawPods.
Welcome back to Just Verdicts. Today, I'm joined by two incredible guests, my partner, Greg Unatin, and our rising star associate, Garrett Trettel, to break down our latest medical malpractice verdict in a case in Indiana County last week. So, last Friday, after a hard-fought trial, we secured a significant verdict for our clients, Kirt and Dorothy, who have endured unthinkable hardship due to medical negligence. This case was about more than just the numbers. It was about holding a doctor accountable for failing to act with urgency when our client's leg and ultimately his livelihood were on the line. In this episode, we'll take you behind the scenes of the trial, discussing the key moments, the challenges we overcame, and the strategies that helped us persuade the jury. We'll also reflect on what this verdict meant for our clients and for future medical malpractice cases. So let's get into it. How do we win this case, and what can other trial lawyers learn from it? Next up on Just Verdicts. All right, so big G, little g, excited to finally get to talk about a great verdict out of our firm. I'm so glad you guys could do this with me today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, boss.
And for all of you listeners, Big G, of course, is my partner forever and ever, Greg Unatin. And little g is rising star associate Garrett Trettel. And the three of us got to try a really amazing case last week. And the case was entirely put together. The architect, we'll call him, was Greg, and worked up just an absolutely masterful case for an absolutely wonderful family that I got to come in and try with him. And so with that, Big G, why don't you explain for the listeners, some of the facts of this case we got to try last week?
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. So, to go back to the very beginning, 2008, our client, Kirt, was diagnosed with peripheral arterial disease. He had some claudication issues over the matter of a few weeks. Eventually, his toes started to turn colors that you don't want toes to be, and he was admitted to the hospital. During that hospitalization, he had an acute onset of really severe pain in the back of his knee. Now, this becomes relevant later, but let's fast forward now. Because of that acute pain, he was diagnosed with an occlusion in one of his leg arteries, his superficial femoral artery on the right leg. And they did a graft to get around the blockage. It was a fem popliteal bypass graft. And ever since that time, 2008, he was good. He didn't have any symptoms of peripheral arterial disease. They put him on chronic Coumadin, in part because of that clotting issue, but also because he had developed a DVT and a pulmonary embolism during that 2008 hospitalization. But as I said, let's fast forward now. It's November 4th, 2020, and Kirt wakes up in the morning. He's just feeling off. It's about 7 a.m. He was working from home, his job as a chaplain for SCI, the Commonwealth Prison in Pine Grove. He turned on his computer so that he could hear any email pings, but decided he was going to go right back to sleep because he just wasn't feeling good, thought maybe he was getting sick. But no pain, critically no pain at that time. A couple hours later, around 9 a.m., he wakes up and he has this severe pain in the back of his right knee, sort of like the pain he had in 2008 when they did the bypass graft. So Kirt, at first he was just sort of in shock, didn't know what was going on. Decided he would stretch his leg out, walk around a little bit, try sitting in his favorite chair. He tried showering. None of that helped to alleviate the pain. And in fact, the pain increased and started to progressively go up his leg towards his groin. And eventually at 11:30 a.m., Kirt texts his wife, also our client, Dorothy, and says, "Dorothy, I'm scared. I have some really bad pain in my leg. It's in my shin, just like the pain I had in 2008. I'm not sure what to do. Can you come home?" And Dorothy writes back via text, "Don't worry, your INR, which is a measure of Coumadin efficacy, is fine. It was just tested. I'm at the pharmacy. They forgot to fill your order. It was on automatic refill. I'll have it for you soon." Fast forward an hour, and Kirt's son, Matt, who happens to work at Indiana Regional Medical Center, finds out about his dad's pain and says, "That enough of this. I'm going to call EMS, a 911 call." And so Kirt was picked up around 12:30 p.m. and taken to Indiana Regional Medical Center. As soon as he enters the ED shortly after 1 p.m., he's seen by a physician assistant who immediately recognizes that he is likely suffering from critical limb ischemia. Kirt's right leg is pale. It's cooler compared to the left leg. He has now motor weakness, but it's only partial motor weakness in terms of his ankle and his toes. And importantly, he has no palpable or Dopplerable pulses in his right foot. The only pulses available are femoral pulses. So correctly, the PA realizes there's an issue here. She orders ultrasounds of the right and left lower extremities, and she calls the vascular surgeon, the only vascular surgeon who was on call for that hospital, Gregory Lynch. Dr. Lynch takes that call from the wound care center about half a mile away from the emergency department. And the PA informs Dr. Lynch of all those findings I mentioned, tells Dr. Lynch she's highly suspicious of critical limb ischemia. And Dr. Lynch says, "Okay, call me back when you get the ultrasound results." At 2 p.m., ultrasound results come in, and they show acute clots or blockages of not only the original fem-pop bypass graft, but also the tibial vessels. So those are the arteries that supply blood to the muscles and the tissues essentially below the knee. So it really confirmed that this patient was suffering from critical limb ischemia. At that point, as we later found out from depositions, Dr. Lynch knew that this is a surgical patient. He knew that he was dealing with a critical issue, something that was emergent and would require surgery. But instead of coming to the hospital, Dr. Lynch says, "All right, PA, I want you to order a CT angiogram," which, as it turns out, wasn't the wrong thing to do. Our expert agreed that a CT angiogram was appropriate so that Dr. Lynch could understand what, if any, blockages were involved in the arteries of the leg that provided inflow to the leg. Actually, these are arteries really above the waist. They could be the iliac artery, the common femoral artery. So it's not just the leg arteries, but they're critical to evaluate so that you can plan as a vascular surgeon what surgery will need to be performed. So that's 2 o'clock. The PA orders stat CT angiogram of the right leg. And unfortunately, Kirt's IV comes out accidentally. And there is a delay of about 55 minutes in replacing his IV. We don't know exactly why there was a delay. There was some speculation that he was a difficult stick, but the records indicated that his IV was reinserted on the first try. So that always really remained a mystery. But at the end of the day, his IV was not replaced until 3 p.m. And at that time, the supervising emergency medicine physician, who had been aware of the situation all along since Kirt's arrival at 1, Dr. Krieger calls Dr. Lynch and says, "We were delayed on the CTA, but Kirt is having increasing pain. We think maybe we should take him to the OR now. What do you think, Dr. Lynch?" And Dr. Lynch said, no, we need the CTA to be completed. That was at 3 p.m. Meanwhile, Dr. Lynch is still at the wound care center, and he's seeing patients. We would learn later on that Dr. Lynch saw all of the patients who were scheduled at the wound care clinic that day from early afternoon through 3:40 p.m. Now, like I mentioned, that was a 3 o'clock phone call. At 3:45, a radiologist who interpreted the images of the CTA that was finally performed called the ED to report these findings, additional findings of not only the blockages I mentioned, but additional blockages higher up in the common femoral artery, and importantly, a blockage of the deep profunda artery as well. So there was absolutely no blood flow in Kirt's leg whatsoever, just really emphasizing the critical nature of his leg. So that was 3:45, as I mentioned. And at that point, another call is made to Dr. Lynch from Dr. Krieger in the ED or Mary Harmon, the PA, reporting the findings on the CTA. The next entry in the emergency department record is at 4:55 p.m. And it mentions by way of history that Dr. Lynch was in the emergency department reviewing the imaging and evaluated the patient. Dr. Lynch drafted a vascular surgery consult, and in that consult note, he timed it at 5:10 p.m., or at least that's when it was completed. We never knew exactly when Dr. Lynch saw Kirt, but at his deposition, we tried to nail him down on that, and he suggested it was right around the time of 5 p.m. So Dr. Lynch confirms the patient has critical limb ischemia. The physical evaluation is not much different than what it was at 1 p.m. There's still partial but not full paralysis in terms of the right leg. And Dr. Lynch at that point decides, all right, I'm going to secure an operating room so we could do this emergency surgery. And he goes to the operating room. None of this, what I'm about to say, is in the medical records, but he goes to the operating room and he speaks, according to Dr. Lynch, with an anesthesiologist and an unidentified nurse who he believed to be a supervisor of the OR department. And the anesthesiologist and this nurse confirmed that there are only 2 operating room teams available, and they are likely tied up in surgeries for the next 2 hours. That's, according to Dr. Lynch, in his testimony at deposition, what he was told when he tried to get an OR for Kirt. So realizing that he wasn't going to be able to get the staff together or the OR, Dr. Lynch goes back to Kirt, and Dorothy says, I'm sorry, we can't help you here, but we are going to life flight you to UPMC in Pittsburgh. And shortly after 5, Kirt was life flighted. He arrived about 20 after 6 at UPMC Presbyterian. And upon arrival, he's immediately seen by a vascular surgeon who finds that his ankle and his knee are locked, so complete paralysis. And they conclude that there was just no way of salvaging the leg, and at that point, he was only a candidate for amputation. Kirt did have a below-the-knee amputation that night. He developed complications, unfortunately, in the days that followed. He had multiple infections with debridements, and at the end of the day, after 8 more surgeries, he ended up with an above-the-knee amputation. And he was in the hospital for a month before being discharged, not to home, but to a church. So Kirt, as I mentioned, he was a chaplain of the prison, but he was also a part-time pastor. And fortunately, the congregation allowed him to stay at the church where it would be easier for him to recover in the very near term in a wheelchair while their house underwent modifications. And that is the long story of what happened.
Yeah, great podcast, guys. Until next time. No, man, that was an awesome, exact, dead-on summary. And, I think a couple of sort of, interesting things that I thought about the case. And Garrett, you and I actually went out there, and I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, Greg, but, so while the surgeon who's on call, he's the on-call surgeon, and he's getting call after call after call. This is an emergency. And he's over at this wound clinic. The wound clinic was 2 minutes away. And Garrett and I, because we leave no stone unturned, we went over there and we drove the distance, didn't we, Garrett?
Yeah, bloody foot and all, just to get us in the door, right?
And did you speed? Did you speed, Garrett?
No, I think I was going at a doctor's pace, right?
And the doctor, and we could have impeached him with this. He said how long did he say it took to get over there?
I think he said
Four
10 minutes.
minutes?
He said 3 minutes. But when I timed it, Garrett, at a reasonable speed, it was 1 minute and 50 seconds. Maybe that was a critical piece of information we forgot to raise, but no, I mean, and the weird thing too was the hotel we're staying at, like literally is looking at the hospital. You look out your window, you're looking directly at the hospital, and you can almost see where the wound clinic is. But I bring that up in the sense of partly, I think maybe the absurdity of this case. Call emergency room physician saying, red alert. This is really, really dangerous emergency situation. And, the surgeon is continuing to see these just elective, as they said, very important, but nevertheless, elective non-urgent patients, and really never gets over to see poor Kirt until it's too late. We had a very, very strong timeline that was laid out in those records. But that said, fellas, I mean, from your perspectives, and let's start with the young gun, Garrett. As a young attorney coming into this case, what did you think about it going in? And again, from your perspective, I'm sure Greg and I, grizzled veterans, may have some different things we were worried about. But what were some of the things that concerned you going into the case, like hurdles that we were going to have to overcome?
Yeah, and I just want to touch on absurdity really quickly. When we had Dr. Lynch up on the stand, we were talking, there was a big debate as to whether he was at the hospital sooner when he got to see Kirt, and we were grilling him on, when he got there, what he did, and you asked him, he had mentioned that the OR and the pharmacy were in different floors, I think, and that it was his practice to take the stairs, in fact, instead of taking an elevator. And I remember just thinking about how absurd that was. And in an emergency situation like this, a doctor would take the stairs.
That's true. And he even said that the ER was in the basement and the OR is on the fourth floor. And he's like,
Yeah.
I walked up there to go find the OR. And I think we both kind of looked at each other like, why are you walking?
Yeah, definitely. But as to your question, Greg asked me to start working on this case later in the last year, a little bit, I think in September. And right out of the gate, one of the first things that, became apparent to me was this whole issue of causation. And when you're dealing with critical limb ischemia, the conventional wisdom is you have about 6 to 8 hours from the onset of symptoms before the leg is likely unsalvageable. And, in our best case scenario, you look at the timeline here, you're kind of dealing with somewhere around 9 o'clock, and then hopefully getting the surgeon in there around 3 o'clock. So, even in our best case, we were right on that 6 hour window. And, I thought that would be almost an insurmountable obstacle, something that the defense would be able to point out and, quickly extinguish our case. But, as a young attorney, I've only, been privileged to be in one trial so far previous to this one, and it was a med mal with Greg last year in May, and it's a bit different case, orthopedics altogether. But to the point, I was surprised at trial when their expert witness was only up there for about 10 minutes. In fact, I was doing research on a totally different issue, and by the time I looked up from my laptop, he was already off the stand. So I think, as a new attorney, it's interesting and surprising to see how things actually turn out at trial. It's a fluid, almost living beast all of its own, and you can't really ever be certain how things are going to play out. And I think that was noted throughout our conversations throughout the week. We start off on Monday thinking the case is going to be one thing, and then, Thursday night we have our final conversation, and we have totally changed the focus of the case.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and we'll touch on some of the other hurdles that we had to deal with. But I think you hit the nail on the head that certainly we were all very concerned about causation going in. But you raised a really good point that I'll flip over to Greg, which is, this idea of, those records look like they were airtight. And, Greg, in your deposition, I mean, you seemingly, nailed the surgeon down as to what time thereabouts did he get to the hospital. But come trial time, now a new narrative and potential, series of events occurred that we could not have necessarily planned for.
Yeah, we went into the trial thinking that we had this one, fact that the jury just would not be able to get over, right? The fact that at 3:45, Dr. Lynch was contacted with the results of the CT angiogram, which he said he absolutely needed, but he didn't come to the hospital until like 4:55 to evaluate the patient. So you have like an hour and 10-minute delay for no reason whatsoever. He was even done seeing patients at that time at the wound care center. But, like you said, even though we thought we nailed him down at his deposition, when it came to trial, they used actually an audit trail to try to suggest that he came right to the hospital at 3:45 or 4 o'clock at the latest and accessed the images at the hospital at 4 o'clock and therefore, was rushing to see Kirt. So it took that fact away from us. And, we really, we were able to take advantage of the audit trail issue. And you extremely astutely pointed out that they were misleading the jury on that audit trail. And I'll let you explain that a little bit more later. But at the end of the day, like we kind of had to take a hit a little bit on that just can't get over issue. And we realized like we probably could have just really boxed him in a little bit better at his deposition. I could have. And, I think sometimes you hear things at depositions and you think you hear what you want and you think you got the fact that you need. But when you read back the transcript, you realize it's still a little bit gray. And I remember asking Garrett, I'm like, where is it where he said he definitely saw Kirt right around 5 o'clock? And Garrett was like, well, he doesn't really say that. I'm like, what? Yes, he did.
Well, he did kind of say that. And then he was like, it was sort of like more around 4:55. Then of course you get into trial time and it's, he was over there at 3:45. And, and it's a good learning point for all of us. I mean, dude, you and I have been doing this for a long time now. And, I think it was maybe John Perry I heard at a PHA seminar who was just talking about how critically important that is to just everything you can, just nailing the story down. And honestly, when he said that, and that was actually pretty recently when he gave that presentation, kind of went over my head a little bit. But when you run into scenarios like this, when this whole new narrative appears at trial that you could not and were not expecting, you kind of see, how important that can be sometimes. And I don't know if that's us, asking catch-all questions at the end, like, is there some other, series of events that you haven't discussed with us yet that's important in this case or something. But something important, I think, for all practitioners to keep in mind, nailing down that story as best you can. And again, this, I think, pivots into something else that I've talked about recently on the podcast, which is, Rick Friedman, you've got to roll with the punches. You have in your mind, okay, this is how our trial is going to go. We've got it perfect. It's laid out. Bing, bing, bing. Here's our timeline. It's clear as day. We've got our aha moment. And then literally as soon as Brett stands up in his opening, and, Brett's a really sharp trial lawyer, and, he basically uses it immediately to hurt my credibility in opening because I'm telling them this is the timeline. These are the exact times. And here he's saying, oh, no, what he just told you is wrong. And we're going to show you that this guy was over there an hour earlier, and you're sitting there thinking like, well, how the heck are they going to do that? But it's still a tough thing, but you roll with the punches. You know what I mean? Like you take what we're given in trial. And I thought we did a really good job of kind of rolling with where they went with things, even though, as Garrett pointed out earlier, it wasn't exactly like what we thought it was when we went into trial that day. But some of the other hurdles in your mind, Greg, Garrett talked about, obviously it's a timing case, it's a minutes matter case. You've got a really tight window because, the client, through no fault of his own, doesn't get to the hospital right away. And then if you're, counting the clock down from 6 hours, could surgery even have been, feasibly performed in time? So, I mean, obviously we've got that one. What were some of the other things in the course of the trial you felt were, whether it was a trial or you were thinking going in, that were obstacles for us?
Well, I think just the fact that we had joint torted with other defendants. The first part is making sure they're not on the verdict slip. If you could, you can make sure that's the case. Unfortunately, the sole expert who we presented on liability did not criticize the other defendants in this case. He just criticized the vascular surgeon, Dr. Lynch, and that's it. And at the end of the day, the defendant, sole remaining defendant, Dr. Lynch, did not have any criticism himself through expert testimony, the settling defendants. So it was pretty clear that they were not going to be on the verdict slip. But nonetheless, there was that empty chair defense, right? There was the testimony from Dr. Lynch that he had this conversation around 5 o'clock, and he was told that no operating room was available. And even though, we were trying to focus on everything that happened prior to that time, our plan was to show that the surgery should have been performed, as Garrett said, no later than 3 p.m. because we know causation was an issue, and any longer than that would have really put causation in doubt. Dr. Lynch went there nonetheless, and it showed that, he made an effort, and there was something that was beyond his control that contributed to Kirt's injury. Not only at 5 o'clock, but also if you consider the whole IV issue as another incident that was beyond his control. And, I think like going into the trial, we didn't really think enough about how he could take advantage of those two situations, right? Those two situations that were beyond his control. But he really did. So I think those were two important challenges to the case that I thought would be sufficient for a jury to find that Dr. Lynch, did his best, and beyond, besides his best efforts, there were things beyond his control.
Yeah. I mean, those are, the IV wasn't his fault, and so we had to find a way to counter that, which I think that we did, thanks to your guys' thoughts that Thursday night on how to frame that. And then, how do you, we had to figure out a way to get around, supposedly, right or wrong, somebody told him that there were no ORs available when he wanted to perform surgery. And I mean, what an easy out for the jury, for him there, for a jury to give him a pass and say, hey, this is terrible for Kirt, but it's not the surgeon's fault that he was told wrong or inaccurate information. And I don't think anybody thought that Dr. Lynch made that up, whether there was a miscommunication, whether he didn't properly follow the policy because he was somewhat new. I mean, we'll never really know exactly what happened there, but we had to deal with that issue. And then you layer on top of that, and, obviously I'm making us seem like such amazing trial. Look at what we came over. But it was a lot. I mean, there's a lot of hurdles because then it's, on top of those incredibly difficult problems, you've got, it was COVID. And then you've got the beating of the drum of this is the only vascular surgeon at IRMC. Boom. This is the only vascular surgeon in the entire county. Boom. And, the multifaceted problems that creates. Number one, self-preservation of the jurors. I don't want to enter a verdict and, run our one surgeon out of town. Number one. Number two, what if I or one of my loved ones has to get vascular treatment for some reason and we have to go face this guy and I just entered a verdict against him. Number two, and then number three, hey, we're a small community hospital. We only have one surgeon. He did the best that he could. He was seeing these important patients over there. It was the pandemic. These people hadn't been seen in a while. What if those cases turned out? And, again, I thought Brett did a really good job, trying the case. I did take issue. I didn't raise it like I was telling you I was going to, but I did think that it was a little bit of a cheap shot to make the comment of, just imagine, ladies and gentlemen, that if he had left these important patients at the wound clinic to go over and treat this emergency, and one of them went on to die or have some terrible complication, these, sharks over here, we'd be right here with them suing him for that case, like he's damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't. But, I think that's a really bogus argument, and maybe we should eliminate that stuff in the future because it's it's just so irrelevant, speculative, and prejudicial to make those arguments, but they always do. That's like the 100th time I've heard that. But anyway, not to beat a dead horse, but I mean, there was a lot to overcome in this case, notwithstanding, we had some very good facts and super important. I mean, from a trial perspective, I would say maybe those are the best clients we've ever had as far as how they came off at trial. Yeah. What did you guys think?
Hey, to your point, Brendan, of them being, great clients, and also part of something we thought was going to be an issue was perhaps, the defense pointing the finger at Kirt for not getting to the emergency room sooner, We had him waking up at about 7 or 9, somewhere in between there, and not really getting to the emergency department until a little after 1 o'clock. And we were concerned that the defense would raise the text messages and his history of peripheral artery disease as, a defense of contributory negligence. But, I think when we got to trial and, Brett heard the testimony from Dorothy and Kirt, he knew that was the wrong tree to bark up. 100%. These two folks could not be blamed whatsoever for anything that happened. Talk about two of the nicest, best people I've ever met in my entire life. And I mean, looking back in hindsight, that was a concern, and a valid concern, of course. But I think you have to really take that kind of defense and put it into context. You have to consider your plaintiff, and when you have two folks like this, that's never going to fly.
Yeah, and they were just both spectacular. I mean, I think I'll think about Kirt's testimony about, his ability to sort of reassess his views on the world and his biases from working in the prison and getting to know the men that he was, providing religious freedoms to, whatever they were, not just his religion, like whatever they wanted to practice. And understanding like where they were coming from and the handicaps, socioeconomically that they were starting off with, and then becoming more and more dedicating and finding, passion in trying to help rehabilitate those men so that they could become productive members of society and not just writing them off as, lost causes. I mean, and I'm not even doing anywhere near the justice to how he described that, which I thought was just absolutely compelling. And that was just a small part of it. And then, Greg, why don't you talk about, because you did a great job in prepping him for great testimony, the kind of testimony that's going to resonate with a jury. But he bought into it because that's the kind of person that he was. That was his story anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm always looking, I think we're always looking for that ideal victor versus victim scenario where we can portray our client as the victor. To the wise advice of Jesse Wilson. And he was just the perfect man, the perfect plaintiff for that victor persona, because that's who he is. We didn't have to, play mind games with Kirt to say, hey, you need to buck up and just, be thankful for what you have. That is the way he wakes up every single day. And he's just, as Garrett alluded to, he's just an amazing person, and it's so inspiring. And we have, had the good fortune, I suppose, to Kirt's bad fortune, to have an injury which speaks for itself. His gait, the way he walks, is extremely awkward. With this very, he has this prosthetic that goes essentially all the way to his hip, and it's not ideal by any means. So not only that, but these amazing photographs as well of Kirt just going back and doing the things that he does and did before his amputation, like playing in bands. He was on stages, standing at the pulpit, even playing basketball. Although he was in the wheelchair for that, he was so eager to get out there. He was trying to play basketball with the youth of his church before he even had his prosthetic. So, it's just can't say how happy I was that we were able to play that victor card.
Yeah, and I think, especially in a case like this, I do want to talk about the event versus systems dispute and so forth. But this was an event case, and while event cases are winnable, and people should not just write them off as, oh, don't handle medical negligence event cases. They're difficult. They're very difficult, and especially out here for the reasons mentioned before, when you're suing the only vascular surgeon in the entire county that any of the jurors would be able to go to if they want local care. That creates a real problem and so you kind of need to have a chance of winning a client like Kirt and a client like Dorothy, to balance that and have this person that at least some members of that jury are going to go to the absolute mat for, which from what we gather, I think is what happened in those deliberations, and I'll also point out, you obviously did a wonderful job preparing him, Greg, and I met and prepared with Dorothy a bunch too. But who they are and how amazing they are and how amazing they, just told their story to the jury is also, that's beyond us. You know what I mean? Like, we're just kind of like, conduits for them to tell their story. It wasn't, not to take away anything from any of us, but they were just incredible people, had an amazing story to tell, and we were able to kind of facilitate that, and the jury was able to see that, and you kind of got to get out of the way. And on a related note, I'm going to pat ourselves in the back that, like what you said, Greg, such an obvious injury. And, some people might be tempted to make him, take off his pants or something and show the stump to the jury, or, hand the, prosthetic leg around or something like that. And we didn't do that at all. He wore pants every time. He never even showed his leg during the course of trial. And I think that's a really good observation too you had, that basically the photos that we showed, all the before and afters, it was him doing the same stuff, just without a leg, which I think was really, really good. Just avoiding all that, woe is me, he's not going to get better and anything like that. I think, again, it's all those little pieces go in from a credibility perspective to the jurors who are going to be for us, and maybe help make a dent in some of the ones that, were not initially for us, is my thinking.
Well, along the same line, what do you think about the fact that, we really didn't call any before and after witnesses? And Garrett, maybe you could speak to this too. It sort of bucks the trend of keeping your client relatively short in the direct and letting other people talk about your client instead of themselves.
And I think, Brendan put that together pretty well. The injury spoke for itself 100%. And, I managed to talk to some friends of Kirt, and they shared some touching stories about times they had with Kirt before the incident. And, I think to the point of, avoiding the victim mentality in cases like this, I don't think anybody wants to hear that. And I think everybody knows that these people suffered greatly. And to belabor that point, I think is, trying to garner sympathy from the jury that I think is over the top. People don't want to feel that. We were at a CLE early last year, and Jude Basil was talking about righteous indignation. And I just don't think righteous indignation really aligns with that sort of victim mentality. Righteous indignation, you want to root for somebody. And if they're the victor or if they're the underdog and they're fighting back, not asking for sympathy, I think that is what kind of stirs those emotions up in people. So when you have this guy, I don't know about you guys, when he got up on the witness stand, I was getting ready to catch him. I thought he might fall. That, I think, did so much more than any before and after witness would do. And I think to the point of bucking the trend of, short damage witnesses, I think you really want to consider, how much do the injuries speak for themselves?
And Garrett, I think, it took me a while to kind of, try enough cases to start to get the feel of it, but you don't want to waste the jurors' time. And it's kind of like with an injury like that, you don't need before and after witnesses. You know what I mean? Like, they get it. They get what this guy was before. They get he doesn't have a leg now. They can all imagine. We can provide them additional details of things that maybe they didn't realize that interfere with his life. But do they really need, a friend telling him that I used to go on walks with him beforehand and he used to love walking? Yeah, we all like walking. Yeah. I think the before and after witnesses, like, I guess maybe the big takeaway for anybody listening is, we always are getting these different pieces of advice, like, oh, do this, like before and after witnesses are critical. And, for instance, like polarizing the case with Friedman. That was the biggest takeaway. Before and after witnesses. But that was because it was an invisible injury. It was a concussion case. And those are the most important witnesses for those cases. But when you have, a catastrophic injury that nobody can disagree with and everybody can see with their own two eyes, you're doing, I think, your case a disservice if, you're like, do you not see, let me bring another witness in to tell you about, how significant of a loss this is, ladies and gentlemen. It's like, we get it. And I'm glad, for whatever reason they didn't work out. I'm sure it wouldn't have hurt the case. For instance, the one guy seemed like he was pretty good, but he had like a concussion himself or something. But the way it played out, that's the other thing. Sponsorships theory, it doesn't, the testimony of the impact on their lives does not get any better than what Dorothy and Kirt told us. So if you bring in one more witness in to layer it on there, you're basically like, that wasn't good enough. And here's another witness to tell you about that. So I think it worked out really well that it was just the two of them, ultimately. So one little thing I'll comment on, because I'm always talking about the importance of focus groups and all this different stuff. The focus groups are incredibly helpful for preparing, but kind of a mixed bag on the results that, we got here, at least so far as forecasting, the victory, maybe the range of value was somewhat on point. But going back to, you can never, when you can't know definitively what story they're going to come with on the defense, like none of our focus groups included this idea that, this alternate reality that actually he's claiming he showed up at like 4:00 rather than 4:55,
Nor did it include his defense that these wound care patients, could have had the sniffles or a temperature, which was actually a wound infection in disguise, and to make it seem like they were much more serious cases.
Yeah, I
don't know that the jury necessarily bought into that. I didn't. I don't know about you guys.
I thought that didn't totally resonate. Oh, these are, these wound people with like, not urgent cases. They're important too. It's like, yeah, we get that. But there's a guy with an emergency condition 2 minutes away that sort of takes priority over these people. So yeah, no, I didn't think that one was great. Why don't we talk about, how we approach the order of proof? And I think a couple interesting things was, we didn't call Lynch as on cross in our case, which is different than usually how we do it. And, the first witness we started off with.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Why did you decide you didn't want to call Dr. Lynch? I think it's because you didn't want to give him a sneak preview of where you were heading with something, right?
Well, that's true. Actually, we were planning on it. Well, I mean, it was kind of it was sort of two-tiered. And again, you take what you're given during trial, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you get little mini gifts. And so one of those. Well, I thought, my biggest reason right off the bat for not calling him as on cross was because your exam of our expert, Dr. Brewster, was so comprehensive. At least at that point in time, I thought a lot of what I wanted to cover with Lynch, you had kind of already covered. And so then at that point, it's like, well, if I'm basically just getting from him exactly what you just showed everybody from Brewster, now it seems like maybe somewhat redundant. But then factor that with Dr. Brewster, and Garrett did us a solid by pulling strings to get us the daily copies that the court reporter didn't necessarily want to provide us. But we were able to confirm something that Brett had said to Dr. Brewster, which was, I want you to assume that, and he shows him this audit trail. And I'm going to complain about something about that in a moment too, as I want to do. But he shows him this audit trail out of nowhere, and I'm not even sure that Brewster had ever even seen it. And he just shows him these different times, and he says, I want you to assume that Dr. Lynch is going to testify that right here on this time entry at 4:02, that was him on a computer in the hospital, not at the wound care center, suggesting that, he got the call at 3:45 and raced over there, and he's already on a computer typing away 402. And, I was just like, what is that? Like, he only showed him like one section of the audit trail. And, for any of us geeks that deal with this stuff all the time, there's like 10,000 columns of these audit trails that go on and on. So you're like, I think there's probably, and I remember, Greg, you and I were like driving back to the hotel. I'm like, don't those things have like the name of the computer that like the person's looking on? Why didn't he show him that? And, then sure enough, we go back and I start, becoming, forensic, wizard guy on my, on the audit trail. I'm like, device name, we've got it. And it showed at 402 from 135 to 402, he's on the same computer the whole time. And then the next entry isn't until 5:10, like an hour and 10 minutes later. And lo and behold, all the entries thereafter are on a different computer. And so then I'm like, well, now we can potentially set something up that's going to really hurt their credibility, because we can kind of show the jury, hey, Brett and Dr. Lynch are trying to pull one over on you, basically. They were trying to make it look like something that it's not. And that's kind of one of those moments. I mean, it didn't come off as like an absolute bombshell mic drop like we like sometimes, but I think it came off as enough of a thing. I don't know what you guys think.
Well, I don't know. My lesson from that is never underestimate the objections you might hear from defense counsel. Right?
Yeah,
I mean, if he was being a complete hypocrite, he objected to your use of the device name from the audit trail. Say, we don't know what that means, right? But we knew what all the other columns which you showed Dr. Brewster in cross-examination. We all know what those mean.
Yeah. I mean, for the listeners, for anybody who doesn't know what like an audit trail looks like, I mean, this was a gigantic spreadsheet of just like stuff, like dates and times and random column entries of God knows what. And Brett goes up there and he's confronting our expert with this thing with no foundation whatsoever. Our experts even, like I said, I've never seen this before. No problem, ask him every question that you want. And then when I get up there and I start getting into it, I'm like, well, let's actually scroll over a little bit, doctor, and show you the whole audit trail. And we get to the device column. Obviously Brett realizes at that point, oh crap, like he's he's going to point out the inaccuracy of what I was showing, and he objects, and he objects, and I don't know what he said. He's like, we don't know what this is. And of course, like in one of those, just like you got to keep it together, but my head is just going to explode. The judge is like, yeah, what is all this? It's like, it's the same thing he showed him yesterday, man. Why was it okay then and it's not okay now? But sometimes I will say, and Garrett, this is more for you. You just kind of have to be a bull in a china shop. And I'm like, I'm just kind of like, yeah, I hear all that. And we're just going to keep showing this thing. And I'm just going to keep saying what it is. Device name, look over there. And it's like, well, wait, hold on. But we don't even know. Oh, I got that. I'm going to move on. And one more question about that, that thing. Because I think maybe more than anything, the jury could see Brett's getting up, objecting, like he doesn't like, and they can sense that. And I think maybe that's another takeaway, like careful with your objections sometimes, because, you're calling more attention to like, this is bad.
Well, the bell had already rung, and so we were optimistic that the jury got it. But in hindsight, I think they were thinking, what a jerk that plaintiff's attorney is. He's sneaky. It's a good thing that defense attorney objected.
Probably. That's usually what they think. I try not to be. But, and then in closing, of course, I bring it up again and then more objections about it. Like, okay, here we go. But funny and fun. And I love those moments, though, when you kind of like maybe figure something out and, you can kind of like, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like kind of punch back a bit, because, Brett's really sharp. He's really very smart. The arguments with the judges, he's very, very formidable. We had to kind of pick and choose our opportunities. But I think that's another important thing to keep an eye on for everybody is I don't know what you guys think, but I felt in hindsight, I made a little bit of a blunder in the way that I phrased my undermining that gave him an opportunity in opening, which was, I suggested that they were going to blame our clients for not having gotten to the hospital sooner. And Garrett, you mentioned this earlier. We felt that was one of the potentially big defenses or issues that we could have a problem with in the case. Why? Because that's what the focus groupers told us. Why didn't he get there sooner? And so we're assuming they're going to do the same thing, and they'd made references to that. But I think I could have phrased that differently because it provided Brett, this moment of righteous indignation to say that he was shocked and, something else that I would say that they would ever blame our clients. And you never want to give your opponents any opportunities to kind of seize those at least momentary moral high grounds or, have their little times for righteous indignation if you can avoid it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it hurt when he came over and put the finger down on our desk. And he said, "They're the only ones in this courtroom blaming anybody." And I was like, "Buddy, how many motions in limine did you file on this stuff to get some of this information in? I think I spent the New Year holiday working on this stuff." And yeah, it's ridiculous, but it's a good point. You want to be careful as to, the undermining section is super important in an opening and putting things into context, but you got to pick and choose your battles. And if you do give them that high ground, you have to be accountable for it. And I think you did a great job in closing and kind of tying that loop up.
I think another kind of just big picture thing, Garrett, this is like, you had a question, and I think that the first witness is sort of an example of it. So, as we've talked about, the medical record had this amazing timeline that laid out the case exactly like Greg described. 1:18, within 12 minutes of this guy walking in the door, there's a call to the surgeon. We think this guy's got this emergency condition. Call again an hour later, call again an hour later, call again 45 minutes, and he doesn't come over. But I'm actually starting to forget where I'm going with this. But I think, I know what it is.
Yeah.
So Garrett, to your point, you were like, why didn't we call, the PA who wrote the whole timeline, and why didn't we call this emergency room doctor? Oh, and we didn't mention that. So then the emergency room doctor writes an addendum after the fact, like 4 days later, and just lays out this, it tells you what was going on and writes this just really, you don't see this in medical records that often, but basically we did everything we could to expedite this guy's care, calling vascular surgery on multiple occasions, only for it to end in supposedly there wasn't an OR available for this guy and we had to ship him out. And you, I think is a fair question, Garrett, are like, why didn't you guys call them? Like, why didn't you call Krieger? Why didn't you call PA Harmon? Greg, what is your thought on why we didn't do that?
Well, so PA Harmon had no real memory, and that was consistent along the line with the witnesses from the hospital who were produced for deposition. There was also a nurse. Jill Helferick was the OR manager, but she really wasn't, involved in the ED per se. But I was just getting the sense that if we called Dr. Krieger, there's nothing that he would have remembered beyond his records, just like PA Harmon. So, it was really a product of not wanting to waste my time and money to take his testimony when I knew we could get all of that good stuff in his note in through our expert.
Yeah, that was my main takeaway is the best evidence is the record. That's the best. It was written contemporaneous or closest to the events in question, and any hindsight testimony is going to be, in my estimation, a little bit weaker and watered down. And from our perspective, as far as the hospital and the doctors and everybody, they're not looking to do us any favors. And Greg and I have been down this road many times where, we have called people at trial. And I think that, Jill, the OR manager, is a perfect example of this. here they come into trial and they start telling a slightly different story than what's in their records or what they previously testified to, because they're trying to help the people at the hospital, or they've got to work with that surgeon again. So they're going to shade things in their favor, and certainly not ours, unless it's just this, 1 in a million whistleblower type, which they never are. And, we encountered that with the OR manager who gave us, Greg, you got rock solid. And I have to, this is just another takeaway for anybody out there, but young lawyers in particular. I mean, Greg's workup on the discovery, the level of the repeat, motions, like the RFP, interrogatories, depositions, to get all this material to figure out who was in the hospital, when they were there, what was the OR schedule, in response to all these different BS objections, was absolutely critical to us to winning that case. So, we come in and we talk about these trials, but, the bedrock is, do you have the goods going in? And Greg, you gave us the goods to have a fighting chance in that case. But back to Jill Helfrich, no matter what you do, you had a dead on, lock solid deposition of hers, and rock solid responses to the discovery that showed definitively that there were people there. There was a surgical team there. There was an anesthesiologist there anytime that this surgeon wanted them, anytime. And that was it was locked in. But take her testimony, and on cross-exam, Brett's like, but isn't it possible that somebody called off that day? And she just was all too happy to be like, oh, probably. I mean, it was the pandemic. We were having people call off all the time. It's very possible that, never said this in the deposition. It completely countered everything in there. And yet they do that. And so, yet another reason, Garrett, that you've got to be so cautious when you're calling witnesses that are potentially adverse to you, to get those little pieces that you need, because they're not going to go out of the way to do you any favors, I think.
Yeah, and you don't know how well they're prepared either. She may have just read her deposition in preparation and ignored all the additional information the hospital provided after her deposition, because Jill was not prepared to fully answer our questions at her deposition. That's why we had to follow up so much. But it is, it's just, it's a bit of a roll of the dice when you're calling a representative from one of the, at this point, settling defendants. And I think when we go back into our next trial, we might second guess a little bit who we want to call as if on cross-examination. Now, I think we needed to call her no matter what, but we did choose her as our first witness. And we went back and forth when we were planning as to whether she should be a first witness or a second witness. But Brett, in his closing, really took advantage of the fact, and I thought this was interesting, really took advantage of the fact that she was our first witness. And you would think that our first witness would be, a very, very important witness for us to support our case. And she heard us, and he pointed that out. So, I don't know what else we could really do in the situation in our case that we just tried, because, again, we didn't expect her to be so malleable in his hands on cross-examination and to just harm us that way. But
the reality is,
yeah.
She gave us so much stuff we had to get in. We had to get that policy in. We had to get the fact that no matter what, she's got a great team and they get it done within 30 minutes or less, no matter what. So it's never going to be perfect, and I still would stand by calling it. It just, I think, points out that idea of like, you've got to be so cautious with calling some of those people. I just want to make a couple other quick points for listeners. Some of the things just kind of reiterating. I sometimes feel stronger about things the more trials I try. So as you guys saw, I pretty much wrote out my opening and my closing word for word, and gave it largely word for word. And that might sound, pretty dull and uninspired. But I read this book called, it's like Stand Like Lincoln, Talk Like Churchill or something, which I really recommend to anybody for public speaking and like things to keep in mind for public speaking and so forth. And they advocate, and that's what apparently Churchill did, was he would have, his speech is completely written out, and it was reference line, look up, give it to the people, give it to the audience, looking them in the eyes, look down, next line, and so forth. And that actually controls your pacing. And the reason why I still stand by this, especially in med mal cases, is I think the words matter so much, the way you say things, and the conciseness and the efficiency with which you can get your ideas across, and that you can sync it precisely with your visuals and everything, versus no matter how much you practice it. And I've certainly given openings and closings without, notes and so forth. I'm going to continue to do it this way. There's just too many pros. There's no perfect either, but there's too many pros, I think, with, creating it ahead of time and giving it largely from a pre-created speech than trying to go off something that you just have in your head. But that's just my two cents.
I thought your delivery was amazing. And I was just in awe that you did have these notes in front of you and you appeared to be reading. And I emphasize appeared because it barely appeared that you were reading. It almost seemed like it was all committed to memory. So I honestly don't know how you did that without practicing that many, many times. Maybe you did. But
well, not the
I'm
closing.
Buy that book.
That book's a really good one.
Can you hear him?
Yeah, it has tons of good ones. And I think, in closing in particular, there's a lot to cover there. You know what I mean? And I will also say this, a dirty little secret. I thought that some of the pieces that were put together in closing about Kirt and Dorothy, and I think I told you this, Greg, that, when those two gave such absolutely compelling testimony, and I was having like a panic attack at like 11 p.m. the night before closings, because I'm like, how can I do justice in even summarizing what they talked about and their loss compared to the way that they described it in the closing argument? And I knew that it was important that I be able to do that. And I think it came out really well. But a bunch of sections, I literally was like, I would just take my ideas. I'm like, this is what I want to say. This is what they said. And I would stick it into ChatGPT and I'd say, come up with something compelling for me to say here. And then it would come out with these unbelievable things, and I would take it and I would wordsmith it. And so, a little hack. I thought it came up with these just unbelievable, better ways of saying what I was trying to get across. And I don't know. I'm going to do that again, because I thought it was just killer, some of those lines that I had about, Dorothy and Kirt, and, this was a guy that liked to play in the game, not stand on the sidelines. And, it was hitting those rules of three, like bing, bing, bing. And, there's just a lot of good stuff I thought it gave me.
And to your point on, in your opening, first, it's a med mal case. And I think a lot of jurors come in there, and rightfully so, they're a little intimidated. But, your prose and your pacing and in the way that you did that opening almost was like, story time when you're a kid, like super slow, and everything is understandable and simple. And suddenly this big, scary case is something that you can wrap your mind around. And I think it brought a lot of comfort to the jurors. Second thing I'll say about the opening and the closing, and I think we talked about this earlier today, is the increased risk of harm standard and causation. I don't want to steal any of your thunder.
No, go for it, Garrett. I'd like to hear your perspective.
I think in the opening, you had this great analogy about, causation in this context, kind of being like Steelers versus the Ravens, last drive of the game, Ben Roethlisberger's taken out by a cheap shot. Steelers lose. We don't know for sure if the Steelers would have won that game, but we could probably say that increased the risk they would lose. Now, I mean, did that hit with a jury of, I think, 11 women? Not saying these ladies out there cannot be Steeler fans, but, I think the closing reiteration with the fireman and the cat in a tree was a much better variation on that for the given the circumstances, and I really appreciated that.
No, I think that's an astute observation. Sometimes you get an idea and you're like, oh man, I really like that Steelers thing, and then here we've picked all women on the jury, and that's not to say that some of the most rabid Steelers fans out there aren't aren't women. But, maybe on the whole, I could have come up with a better analogy that played to my audience, which is I did try to amend it for closing. And I think the one in closing was much better, maybe just spot on in general. But that's another point. So I want to hit that real quick. And then I want to close kind of talking about us as a group and kind of talking about just how we all riffed on everything together to come up with a much better overall trial presentation. But I think that risk of harm, it used to almost confuse me a little bit back in the day. And I was almost like, we got to do an increased risk of harm case. I've heard those suck and everything. Dude, after hitting these analogies and really internalizing it and then realizing like how we were able to use it, I think that is the most formidable argument. All you got to do, just did it increase the risk of harm? Did it decrease the chances of success? And I just think it's such a really strong tool for us medical malpractice practitioners to use to get over that hurdle that so many of us, that's where we lose so many of our cases on causation. And then, Greg, you got it over and over and over and over again from Brewster. And then we knew from the testimony that you'd already gotten from him in his deposition that from the defendant, that we could get it from him too. Get him to, and he did. And I had a whole little section, and he gave us it just 100% that I thought there was a chance. 100%. Yeah. I was even transferring him down because I thought there was a chance.
And I think you took a chance there, to choose that word again, by cross-examining Dr. Lynch the way you did. I mean, it was an open-ended question, but you predicted that he would say, yeah, there was a chance, because what else is he going to say? How else would he justify his decision to take Kirt to surgery? It wasn't a decision to take Kirt to an amputation. It was a thromboembolectomy that was planned. And so I think, as you said before, sometimes you have to be a bull in a china shop. I don't know if this is the same thing, but it's taking chances.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's calculated risk. I think, the 10 rules that Garrett's been, reading lately across and everything, Irving Munger, that guy's name was, those are good starting points. And that one is, never ask a question you don't know the answer to, but the kind of the qualifier is, or that there really couldn't be a bad answer to. And so I thought through that a lot, like what could he possibly say? He wanted to go do the surgery to take the clot out. What's he going to say? Oh, no, I knew there was no chance of saving this leg. I just wanted to do this pointless procedure on this guy. Of course not. Mm-hmm. He gave us even more, and actually when I was transferring down to Pittsburgh, I still thought there was a chance. You know what I mean? Yeah. But anyway, yeah, increased risk of harm is just such a great argument. And so, yeah, I want to wrap up by just kind of like, I think we were a group discussion. We were a group dynamic in coming up with how to present this case from way before trial through trial. But to me, it kind of culminated in that, kind of dinner the night before closings and the night before, their expert. And I want to hear, so from your perspective, you two were sitting there and I come down, I got this great idea, and you guys had to kind of, talk some sense into me, Mm-hmm. How did that all kind of come together with what I thought was a really, really powerful argument in closing that we all came up with?
Well, you presented this argument that was novel, and essentially you put Dr. Lynch in the middle of a system where he was the only vascular surgeon. They expected him to see these wound care center patients, and he was spread too thin, right? He didn't have fellows in vascular surgery, residents in vascular surgery, PAs committed to vascular surgery, like Dr. Brewster did at Mass General for 40 years. And consistent with kind of our approach of trying not to be too heavy-handed with an individual doctor, right? And sort of making that doctor a bit of the victim circumstance, you came up with what I thought, and I think Garrett agreed, was a brilliant argument. But I just could not get over the fact that he still never came into the hospital, even though he knew this was critical to ischemia from 1:18 p.m. and didn't come into the hospital for at least, let's just say, give him the benefit of the doubt, 2 hours and 42 minutes. And so, we were able to kind of do two things. We came up with a theory that was still very critical of Dr. Lynch for not coming into the hospital, not setting up an OR, not reviewing the images of the CTA as soon as they were available like he could have, yet falling back on, well, why didn't he do these things? Because he was a victim of circumstance. He was spread too thin.
Yeah, and I appreciate you guys, calming me down, because I'm like, I've got this great idea and this is what's going to happen. And then you're like, okay, that's good, but maybe we should also do this other part too. And I think ultimately what it came up with, because we all talked through that for a while, like, okay. And it took me a while to get what you were saying exactly, Greg. But then when I got it, it was like a major aha. And so what ultimately came together, and Garrett, you and I talked about this, it really became, in my mind, that Joe Friedism of, how can everything they say all through trial, oh, Dr. Lynch was, he was doing the best that he could. He was seeing these other patients. They're important. It was COVID. He can only he's the only doctor. How can we take all that? How can everything they say be right and we still win? And so you guys astutely pointed out, look, there was this critical point in time. One call, okay, we'll give him a break. Two calls, okay, we'll give him a break. But that third call, that was red alert. That was the inflection point of this whole thing. He knew this client an hour before had an emergency situation. I said, this is a stroke of the leg, ladies and gentlemen. This is a heart attack of the leg, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't just some random condition, okay? And that is what this guy knew. He knew an hour before this guy was having a stroke of the leg, and he doesn't go over. And then he gets this third call. And what is going on in that? And you guys pointed out, like, what was the critical stuff going on there? Number one, you've got an emergency room doctor who's begging you to take this poor guy to surgery. Okay, number one. Number two, you have just been notified that an hour has gone by since you knew this patient had an emergency condition and nothing has happened. This IV came out. He hasn't even been sent for the CT yet. And I can't remember what the third point was, but it was very compelling. And so we laid that all out and we said, that's the moment you drop what you're doing, you cancel everybody, and you drive the freaking 2 minutes over to start making sure this guy gets the care that he wanted. Because he also knew that it took, according to him, 5 to 10 minutes for the CTA to get performed. So within 30 minutes, now we've got this solid timeline. He's there at 3:30 and he's able to get it done. Kirt's leg is treated, in plenty of time. But we juxtapose that with, so that he has no out from an argument. And this is all, and by the way, I will say to everybody, it only took me like 20 years of reading Damages by David Ball to finally get this. But the thing about, in closing, if somebody in deliberations says X, you remind them of A, B, and C. That is such a freaking great way to do that in closing. I've never really done it before, but I did it heavily in this one, and it is money. I think that is such a freaking money way to undermine all their arguments.
And tell everybody, what you warn people they might hear and what they should not consider in the jury deliberations. Fate, my friend.
I had like 50 of them in there. I'm like, which one should I pick?
I just remember fate.
Yeah, that was a good, because we knew from the focus groups that one of the focus groups was hugely given out because of fate, that this was just fate, S happens, God's plan, whatever you want to call it. And, basically, said like, now if somebody back there says, well, maybe this was just fate. Well, you remind them, fate's not on the verdict slip. A lot of good lines. One other good line that I loved giving was, and this is to the last point. So the way he was stuck, according to how we argued it. So you guys helped me show, and we showed that alternate reality. I showed on the timeline, like, this is what should have happened. Okay. Because they had seen what had happened. And we showed them this is what should have happened. It was so easy right here, using just a PowerPoint animation, bing, 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 bing. And I thought that was very compelling. You could see it. It was very straightforward. It made a lot of sense. And then, there was a part, and I don't know if this is righteous indignation or something, just exasperation. But I'm like, and look, if he's so spread thin And he's so busy seeing these patients, and it's COVID, and he's the only doctor and all the different things. And he knows that he can't get over there to take care of this one patient whose leg is literally dying on his watch. Then just send the poor guy down to Pittsburgh. Why are you waiting? Why are you wasting hours of his time for his leg to die there? And so we had them, it was either way. It's like, you got to go over. But if you're so freaking busy that you can't do that for whatever reason, whether it's circumstantial or whatever, he knows that. He knew that. So then call over and say, I just can't do it today. Send this guy down to Pittsburgh.
And that dovetailed nice with testimony from Dorothy. That they were actually asking somebody in the emergency department who they were unable to identify, who came into the room at one point, will you just send Kirt down to Pittsburgh? They know him down there.
Yep. Yeah. And, I just want to say, I think, again, the group trying it as a team is, it's more fun, but it's way better just because of the exchange of ideas and thought processes to do it. I think we're much more formidable as a team than as, individual lawyers trying cases in all but the, most simplistic of cases. And it's just so much more fun. It's so much more, you can laugh. You have these, just laughing about the absurdity that only, we can share together. And I think there's also that aspect of, I'm sure there were moments when I was feeling kind of down about the case. I texted, Lacey, because Brewster kind of got, he got kind of fired up, and I thought he got a little crazy that first day on cross-exam, and I wasn't thrilled. I thought your direct was killer, but then I got worried about how he did on cross, and I was texting Lacey, I don't know how well it's going at this point. And I think even, our clients, all of us, you have those moments where you're kind of doubting things, but when you're with a team and you just kind of make, look, we got to just take what we're getting, take what we're being given, and try to make the best of it. And in this particular case, it worked out really well. Let's wrap up. What the heck? We won. So why don't one of you kind of, how did the verdict shake out and talk about that for a minute before we wrap up?
Garrett, you want to take that?
Yeah. A long deliberation,
Sickening.
I think they went out around noon, and they were talking about getting dinner and everything. And, we are sitting there, I think we went up and down the street a few times. Everybody's in the courtroom waiting. And, of course, in the meantime, they come out with questions. And, early on, there's some amorphous questions. We're not really sure, but I think around, I want to say 2 or 3 o'clock, we're walking back, and I look over at Brendan, and I'm like, hey, what do you think they're asking for the life care plan? And he goes, no shot.
Yeah, I just like, shut up, dude. Don't jinx it.
Yeah. But of course, we sit down, and they're asking for the life care plan. I was like, whoa, no way. But we weren't sure as to what was going on because, of course, there are questions clearly about liability, and, it was a battle. It was totally a battle, and, we had to hang in there in the courtroom for a while. But then, I think around 5, maybe a little after 5, Bonnie pokes her head out. Didn't even say anything, kind of just assumed that we would know. And then, sure enough, the jury shuffles in, and a couple of them aren't looking at us. Everybody, you can feel the tension in the room. And judge reads the first line. Does the jury find defendant Dr. Lynch negligent? Yes. And, everybody, you can feel the excitement grow. Did the negligence of Dr. Lynch cause Kirt Anderson's injuries? Yes. And immediately, tearful joy erupts in the courtroom.
Yeah.
You feel a sea change. And, of course, they read through the amounts, and I think we ended up getting, 2.179?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and of course, Brett pulled the jury, and
that was sickening.
Oh my gosh, talk about an uncomfortable experience. And you could tell that it wasn't, easy going, obviously, for the 5-hour deliberation that they have, but, a 10-12 close call. And there were a few jurors that said yes, that had the look of no on their face, and I think there were some fighters back there for us. And I think at the end of the day, justice was served, and it was a great result for the clients, and a great experience for me. And I was more than happy and privileged to be working alongside you two.
Well, you did a great job.
I feel the same way.
Great to have you as part of the team. Greg and I have done this a bunch of times before, but it was good having you in there with us, and I'm sure there will be plenty more of those in the future. But this was a fun one, super rewarding, great family, and such support for them, all their extended family there. So wonderful experience, and so thanks for jumping on the pod with me and talking about this and memorializing it. It was a lot of fun, and I had a blast with both of you on it, and so glad it worked out. And there was a happy ending. So on to the next one, okay, fellas?
All right. Thanks, man. Good to be here. We appreciate it.
Thanks, boss.
That wraps up this episode of Just Verdicts. Huge thanks to Greg and Garrett for sharing their insights and for their relentless work on this case. Truly could not have done it without them. Greg, in particular, really masterfully worked up an amazing, amazing case. This verdict wasn't just about compensation. It was about justice, accountability, and making sure this kind of negligence doesn't happen to another patient, hopefully, in Indiana County. And there actually may have been repercussions in that regard if you ever want to talk to me outside of the podcast. If you found this discussion valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. And I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider leaving a review if you haven't already, and share this episode and others with other trial lawyers who want to learn about how lawyers are bringing about great results in the courtroom. So thank you for listening. And until next time, this is Just Verdicts. I'm your host, Brendan Lupetin, and keep fighting the good fight.
If you enjoy the show, please subscribe to the Just Verdicts podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving a review. And if you're interested in co-counseling, local counseling, or referring a catastrophic injury case, we'd love to work with you. Call us at 412-281-4100 or visit our attorney referral page at pamedmal.com/refer. Thanks for listening.